Is Lewis Hamilton back to his best after his sprint race win in China? Will we see a straight battle for the title between Lando and Oscar? And is Liam Lawson on borrowed time already at Red Bull? Welcome to the on-track recap from talkSPORT, looking back at the Chinese Grand Prix, the second race in the Formula One season. It wasn't quite as eventful as the Australian Grand Prix was as the season started in Melbourne, but still some big talking points coming from that race. Joining me this week is our F1 correspondent, Piers Pryor, former British F3 driver. And Piers, I mean, you were up doing the updates and we're speaking just after the race now. I'm going to be glad when Japan comes and goes because I can't keep getting up at these times.
I wasn't going to say it, Jonas, but you look tired, mate.
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, look, let's start at the beginning of the weekend. I'm going to breeze over that slight dig straight away and talk about probably the biggest talking point, actually, even though Oscar Piastri won the main race, was that Lewis Hamilton has been on the top step with Ferrari already. Now, I was on talkSPORT on Thursday night speaking with Jamie O'Hara, and he was asking me, how long do you think it's going to be before Lewis Hamilton's getting podiums? And I said very, very confidently and proudly, I don't think we're going to see Lewis Hamilton on the top step for a while, if not this season, and then he goes and does it at the next possible opportunity. So that either means I know nothing, or I'm actually a really good luck charm for Lewis Hamilton, and I'll just keep saying I don't think he'll do well and he'll win the championship. What do you reckon?
I don't know. I don't want to cast aspersions, but, you know, it's cool to see, isn't it? Lewis Hamilton in a red Ferrari. It's his dream, taking a victory, albeit not a proper Grand Prix. It doesn't go down in the records as a Grand Prix victory. But, you know, it shows that on the day when things are going right for Lewis and for Ferrari, that it can happen. And that's sort of born out of the fact that this year looks like it's going to be really, really close. And basically, apart from McLaren having a slight edge at this stage, then it's kind of whoever does a better job of the other three of the four top teams is going to be the one that's either going to pick up the remaining podium places, or if McLaren falter, then they're going to be the ones that take the win. So really good for the racing, really good prospects for the rest of the year, and makes the racing exciting. And also, who doesn't like a Lewis Hamilton victory? I mean, I'm sure some people don't, but generally pretty popular.
I think it's nice that it's been got out of the way, because if it was dragging on throughout the season, you know, when will Lewis get a podium? When will Lewis get a win? I think it would take away from him just getting on with the job and doing it. And actually, in his post-race interview, which I'm sure you've seen, he did take a little bit of a swipe at some of the people that were maybe a little bit disappointed with him finishing 10th in Australia, which shows that drivers do take notice of people saying things on the internet. And it does show that things that people say can still affect someone who's been in this sport for many, many years and won 7 world championships. So, you know, for Lewis to have proven people wrong straight away, he's going to have so much off his back, isn't he, that he's going to be able to just go into the rest of this season now and actually push on and see what he can achieve.
Yeah, I think it's two things, that sort of comment. Firstly, I think it shows how important the psychology is of drivers and what different drivers use to motivate them. Clearly, Lewis uses the negativity that people, you know, band around about him. He's an easy target, you know, 7-time world champion. It's easy to criticize him because he's been around for so long. But then he uses that as fuel to push himself on, and then likes to point out to those people that, hey, you know, I'm not 7-time world champion. Or, you know, some people would say maybe even should have been 8-time world champion for nothing. And actually, completely off topic, I saw a reel or a short this week that said that if Lewis Hamilton had 5 different race results, he could be an 11-time world champion or something ridiculous like that. Because of the number of times he's been right up there. But then the second thing, of course, is that, you know, clearly the drivers, they as much as they say that they don't get affected by comments, they sort of do, because as ultimately it's people's opinions that keep them in a job. Because if the team's opinion is that you're not doing well, then the team will probably not keep you on. And there's some other drivers that are probably worrying about opinions that their teams have about them at the moment. I'm sure we'll get onto that.
Yeah, we will indeed. But, you know, I did actually see that suggestion, and I don't know where it came from, because I heard it on commentary on one of the practice sessions, or I think in the practice session this weekend. But I don't know if it came from Karun or if it came from this guy that I saw doing this reel on a podcast somewhere else. But it's a good point. But it's so many what ifs, isn't it? You know, he could be an 11-time world champion. You know, you could be an 11-time world champion if you were, you know, in your mid-30s and an F1 driver who'd won 11 championships. I think there's a very popular Gino D'Acampo quote, which I won't go into, but it's something about a bicycle.
If ifs and buts for fruit and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas, Jonas.
Yeah, perfect. If this show needs a title, that should be the title. It didn't quite work out for Ferrari in the Grand Prix. Why was that?
It's strange. It's just listening to Lewis Hamilton's post-race interview. It seemed like both Ferrari cars took a decision to make some changes to the setup of the car in the hope that it would even extend their gap or make things better for the race, but actually made things worse. Lewis said that Charles tried something in Bahrain that seemed to work there, and they tried it again for both the cars, and it just pushed him in the wrong direction. It's really hard as a team manager or as a team to make decisions, because in Formula One, if you stand still, it's a cliche, but if you stand still, you're going to go backwards. But sometimes, another cliche, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, they clearly thought there was some more opportunities to find either more lap time or more tire preservation or something. It just didn't work, and especially didn't work for Lewis. It was something that Charles had tried at the preseason testing and Lewis hadn't, and maybe he wasn't able to extract the most out of it during the long Grand Prix.
It does seem strange that they would have success on the Saturday and then decide to completely change stuff and do things differently. But I guess I'm not sat there looking at data. I'm sure they know there's a reason behind that. It's quite interesting, the Shanghai International Circuit. I was there last year, and I think the circuit itself caught out a lot of people. It was considerably warmer than they were expecting it to be. I think they were probably expecting the tyre degradation because it has been resurfaced and it's fairly abrasive, and it's one of the most sort of technical circuits. So, I can only speak from experience of playing it on the game, and it's one of those circuits where it's a bit fiddly, and if you get one thing wrong, it ruins your complete lap. I'm sure that's the same with every F1 track, but it's kind of even more obvious at the Chinese circuit there. But then Pirelli were messing around with the tyres, weren't they? Because the tyres weren't reacting exactly how they expected them to.
But I think that was born out of the fact that the track has been resurfaced from last season. That the teams and drivers and Pirelli knew that it had been resurfaced, but until a Formula One car goes around in anger, you never know exactly how much grip it's going to have. You never know exactly how it's going to affect the tyres. And you've heard from the teams and a lot of the broadcasts that Shanghai has a lot of long corners at high medium speed, which is when the tires get really cooked, basically, because you're loading it with a lot of force through it, with a slip angle, a power on, or you're behind another car, and that's when the heat builds and builds and builds and builds, which is what really kills the tires. And what with the track grip being higher than expected, it made things a little bit more tricky. But then almost conversely, then in the race, everyone was like, oh, actually these hard tires are lasting a lot longer than we thought they would, considering they're softer than the hard tyres were last year. So a bit of a strange one. It's also, highlights how difficult it is to get your head around tyre management, and tyres are organic things. It's an organic compound, rubber and latex and all the bits and pieces with the woven metals and Kevlar. They are a living thing, and to get completely on top of it and extract it is a bit of a black art.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously we saw in the race, the strategies changed very quickly. I think teams saw maybe what Lance Stroll was doing by going quite long straight away, and it meant that most teams went onto the one-stop strategy, which Racing Bulls didn't do, and it hugely affected them. We'll move on to the kind of Red Bull stuff in just a second, but I did see, I think it was Alex Brundle talking about Lewis Hamilton, just to round off the Lewis Hamilton chat, saying that's the reason you sign Lewis Hamilton. If you need someone that's going to manage his tyres, he's going to manage a gap, he's going to keep enough in the tank to be able to finish the race, and if anyone does challenge him, still have enough in the tyres to win that race. That's why you sign Lewis Hamilton, and that's what we saw this weekend. And now he's got that first win. I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to say, when are we going to see Lewis Hamilton on the top step in a Grand Prix, not in a sprint race?
When it's an interesting way you phrase that question.
You don't have to nominate a specific race, but how will it be this year? Will it be before the summer break? Will it be after summer? When do you think things are going to come together? Because things can obviously come together. We've seen it this weekend in the sprint.
Yeah, it's interesting that you phrase that question when, so that I can clearly tell that you think it's going to happen, and I do too, and I really hope it does. I've said it before, I'm a huge Lewis Hamilton fan, but purely because he's shown for decades now that he is capable of doing that. And I think by either by the summer break or shortly after. I think it's going to happen, but I think it's so close at the moment, even though the McLarens are the fastest car. It's not by like half a second. It's not like a Red Bull of 23. It's not like a Mercedes of 2020. It's just a couple of tenths. So when McLaren don't quite get it right, I think that those are the races potentially when there's more variables, and that's when the experience of someone like Lewis Hamilton really plays in. And that's basically the reason he was won the sprint race so convincingly, was his tyre management skills. He knows how to win races. He knows how to manage a race. And I also really enjoyed, a bit of as a side, but I really enjoyed the little chat he gave to the race engineer when they were telling him to swap positions with Leclerc. And he was like, I'll let you know when we'll swap.
Already calling the shots. But I think when you've won 7 world championships, you're allowed to call the shots, right? Even with Ferrari.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is statistically the most successful Formula One driver of all time. So I think, if anyone's going to get away with that, it's going to be Lewis Hamilton.
Of course it is. A great sprint race victory for Lewis Hamilton. Great to see him celebrating. Great to see a big smile on his face. Great to see his dad, Anthony Hamilton, celebrating. Great to see Lewis taking, time to talk about Isaac Hadjar after what happened in Australia as well. I think I saw Lewis. It was a video from the Australian Grand Prix congratulating. Is it Dirksen who won the F2 race? And he was congratulating him. Like, Lewis just seems like he's just loving being in that paddock at the moment and just being involved. And now this is, with the first win is off his back, I think we're just going to see him thrive, and hopefully we do. And now you've said just before the summer break, I'm just looking down the list of races here. I mean, Silverstone would be a good one. You could win it 2 years in a row. That'd be pretty nice for Lewis.
That would be amazing. I think a lot of people would celebrate pretty hard if that happened. I'd love to see it.
Right, let's move on to McLaren then, because it's obvious from Australia that McLaren were the strongest team. It didn't work out for Oscar Piastri in Australia. He fell foul of that, I think it's turn 13 from memory, where it was suddenly wet and went off, beached himself, did a little bit of a reversing trick. Did you see the videos from the crowd of him doing his reversing in Australia? Because there was a typical Aussies cheering an Aussie doing something that's like out of the ordinary.
I haven't seen them, but I can completely imagine. But actually, one thing that I took away from that was that he was clearly very determined to get back in that race, regardless of what the result was going to be. He tried to pull first gear, wheels span. I genuinely thought that's it, race over, he's out. And then next thing you see is him reversing up a slip road, just about managed to get back on track. The determination is there with Piastri, and I like that about him.
Yeah, I think he's shown in all his interviews this weekend. He's very ice cold, isn't he? He's not shown much emotion. He's not shown that his frustration from Australia, basically. He's just come in, he's got on with the job, and to put it on pole position and then go and win the race with, I'll say, relative ease. This is, relative to the difficulties of driving a Formula One car. But given that Lando was his nearest challenger and Lando wasn't really challenging him at any point, was such a dominant race for him. And I actually got a lot of abuse last week because I was doing this show with Billy Munger, and he kind of disagreed that if McLaren had to make a decision, that they might stick with Oscar for the long-term plan and maybe begrudgingly let Lando Norris go. I got a lot of attention from that comment on talkSPORT's Instagram. You can check it out if you want to go and see it. But, I think he has shown in this race that he is really going to stick it to Lando Norris this year. And we are going to hopefully enjoy seeing this battle of two of the... class Lando is still young, considerably younger than me, but two of the youngest talents who really have a championship head-to-head, really, because no one else at this stage, unless there's some major developments with the Red Bull or Mercedes can do something and George Russell can challenge, it really is going to be a head-to-head between these two young guys. And hopefully we see a fair, exciting, I don't mind a bit of tension, but an enjoyable battle this year.
I think we're probably going to get exactly that. I think both Norris and Piastri are very, very talented racing drivers. No doubt about that. That's why they're in the position they are. But I also think they're quite fair racers. They very rarely throw their toys out the pram, especially Oscar. You can't really see him throwing a tantrum, can you? He just he's quite stoic in his approach. He just goes about his business, tries his best. When things go his way, great. When they don't, he's just accepts it. And Norris, likewise, he's very rarely one to throw in a brash move or do something unfair at the very least. But I think almost to a certain extent, everyone's talking up McLaren more than I would I would personally, I think, yes, they have clearly the fastest car, but the margin is not that large. Like, it's not a chasm. It's a small margin nonetheless. I mean, it is a margin nonetheless, but it only takes a few upgrades from different teams or McLaren to lose their way with setup or changeable conditions, as we saw in Australia. We saw the difference between the result between Norris and Piastri was basically luck. It was chance. One of them went off slightly further than the other. Norris nearly did exactly the same thing as Piastri, and that was the only thing that allowed him to win the race. If Norris and Piastri had done the same thing and they'd both spun into that grass, Verstappen would have won the race. They would have both been, still down in third, fourth, fifth, sixth in the championship at this stage, even after this weekend. And maybe the narrative would be completely different. I'm sure that the thing that gets banded around a lot of Norris making mistakes and being mistake prone would have been rife in the media had he not just about kept it on circuit. And that wasn't entirely due to skill. I mean, it wasn't due to lack of skill that Piastri had to then reverse out of the grass. It was basically situation. That was kind of it. I mean, I don't know if you've watched the Jolyon Palmer analysis of that. He did that it was quite a nice little piece on F1 TV where he went through the data, and the only thing that saved Norris is that he actually had a bit more of a big moment earlier in the corner, so slowed down a bit sooner on the gravel to get back on. Whereas Piastri was actually slightly slower going into the gravel, but that meant he went off further, and then that's what caused him to spin. So
right.
I'm looking forward to a lot of racing. I'm looking forward to multiple victories from Ferraris, Mercedes, probably Verstappen, and who knows, even Lawson if he gets his act together.
Even Lawson, interesting. We'll come on to Liam Lawson in a second, but yeah. I noticed the wording that the McLaren team are using, and I know they're very, very confident at the moment. Oscar Piastri has, just after the race, uploaded a picture saying first race win of the season, again, suggesting he expects many more to come. And also, Zach Brown and Andrea Stella were interviewed afterwards on the TV, and they asked Zach Brown, who's very... Zach is very, we've chatted to him loads on our show and on talkSPORT, and he's very well prepared. He knows what he's going to say. He's very precise with his words. And I felt like they caught him slightly in a moment of emotion where they suggested, it's going to happen again, right? And let's look ahead to Japan. How confident are you? And rather than being the usual sort of diplomatic guy, saying, well, it's a new race weekend and, obviously teams will maybe make changes and stuff like that. He was very brash and like, yeah, we're going to have a good weekend. And then kind of realized what he'd said and went back slightly. But that just shows you the confidence they've got at the moment in the car, in the team. When it comes to the Lando versus Oscar battle, say they continue to both win multiple races, but one does take a bit of a lead. At what stage do you think it does become less friendly? Because we see them celebrating together. We see them having a nice photo with Zach Brown at the end of the race. But are we talking, last quarter of the season, or could things get a little bit more tense by midway through the season if they are both fighting it out and one is eking out a bit of a lead?
I think it's after the summer break, really. It's likely they're going to be fairly comparable on points unless one driver has a dip in form or some unforeseen circumstances occur and, unlucky things happen just to one driver. They're going to be close, aren't they? We know that we've seen from the first two races of the year, they've been pretty much inseparable. First race weekend, Norris was there. Second race weekend, Piastri was there. I don't think they're volatile characters, so I don't think it's going to blow up in the way that potentially we saw maybe Hamilton and Rosberg. They're both a bit more intense characters. We're back from, sort of 14, 15, 16 when we saw those days. And maybe not the same even than Verstappen and Hamilton, in sort of 2021. Because again, they're both very intense characters and they were fighting hammer and tongs. I think the niceties may fall away a little bit. Their friendship may just be put on hold a little bit, but I don't see it blowing up. And feel free to bring this clip out when they start having a fight in the Parc Ferme at one of the rounds. I don't know. I'd enjoy that.
We can dig it out of the archives. Something I learned from Drive to Survive, and obviously we take Drive to Survive with generally with a pinch of salt, was that while Lando and Max were fighting out for the championship last year, there was one scene, and I don't want to get it wrong, so I won't say where it was, but Lando did sort of suggest, well, he's flying home with Max because they will often share like private jets to go back to Monaco together. And I didn't imagine that would be the case still, given that they were in a title battle. So as much as people tell you that, there's this fierce rivalry and, you see reports, and I swear people make this stuff up sometimes, that they're not talking, or they're completely limiting all contact. It's like, well, you then watch a documentary on it where they're literally flying home together, really at the business end of the season. So, you can read into these rivalries as much as you want, but I'm not sure how much I believe them. I thought it was nice to see Max Verstappen, although briefly, racing against Lewis Hamilton, because obviously he was on the front row of the sprint race with Lewis. And I thought, oh, we're finally getting Lewis and Max in fairly decent comparable cars racing each other. This is like the old days. And when I say the old days, I mean just after the pandemic / just before. And that didn't last long at all. And that leads me on to Red Bull, because Max seems to be getting more out of that car than perhaps the car is willing to give.
I agree, but I disagree with the sentiment. Generally, I think there's a notion that drivers can get more out of the car than the car can do. That's physically not possible. Again, I'm from an engineering background and a driving background as well. A driver can reach the car's potential. It may be harder for a driver to get to that potential. And I think due to Max's skill, he can make this Red Bull, which is clearly not an easy machine to extract the pace from, he can do that more often than not. And that's just a pure testament to how good, skillful and committed he is. He's just an unbelievable racing driver, worthy 4-time champion. The level we've seen him at the last few years, potentially one of the best drivers we've ever seen. But I don't think he's extracting more than, and I think it's only a matter of time before I hope Lawson gets his head around it and will be up there with Max. I don't know whether Lawson, especially in the first half of the season, will be able to put one over on Max at all. But I think that Lawson's been dealt a pretty hard hand here at the first couple of rounds. He's not got a huge amount of experience. Yeah, I think was it 6 races he'd done before this season, I think. Australia, a bit of an outlier, crazy conditions. Of course, didn't do well in quali, but first proper go in the new car. This weekend, sprint weekend. Of course, Australia, also Lawson didn't have much running in practice, did he? That didn't help things. Then this weekend, sprint weekends, you've only got one practice, then you're straight into a sprint quali. That didn't go well. So at the moment, it's just a couple of things have kind of gone against Lawson that have not helped him. I think he'll find his mojo and then he'll be up in the top 6, top 7 eventually.
And also, he's not driven these 2 tracks. So I think Japan will be one that's a really interesting one, because obviously he's raced a lot in Japan. So, it's if he's going to want a track to come up next where he needs to perform, it possibly is Suzuka. So that's a good thing for him. You can see how much it's affecting him in interviews, though, and how much, Liam Lawson's a very confident guy. You saw what he was like last year when he was at RB and he was racing Sergio Perez and flipping him the bird and everything. He's a very confident guy, and he looks like a broken man already, which is not great. And he's going to have to take a bit of time away between that next race weekend in 10 days time or whatever it's going to be, to really sort of get away from motorsports, really, because finishing so far down, I don't know if you saw the interviews, but when he was being interviewed afterwards, he would say, he was trying not to say too much, but then he'd say something and then he'd realize and think, well, that sounds like an excuse. And he sort of said in the post race one, it's not an excuse, I need to work on things. But he's very much speaking like we need to get more out of this car, speaking about, I'm guessing, his race engineer and people working on his side of the garage. It really does sound, and let's look at it. I mean, I've seen so many memes this weekend and people are very quick to jump on it, a Liam Lawson hate train because, he's not performing and we're big Yuki Tsunoda fans or whatever. But that second seat at Red Bull has been an incredibly tricky position to hold down. And from your position as a driver, not having sat in that car, but having heard everything you've heard about it, is it just down to the fact that it's a very specific setup of a car and most drivers are not really wanting to drive that car setup because it doesn't suit them?
It's really hard to comment. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of talk about the fact that it's hard to drive and hard to extract the pace from. The evidence would suggest that it is, but based on the fact that Max Verstappen can get the results out of it and anyone who's alongside him really struggles. So that would lead us to suggest that it is quite difficult. But I think there's 2 things to consider with the Lawson situation. You mentioned he almost seems like a bit broken and he's very quick to point the fingers at himself in interviews. And I can recognize that. It's a psychology of an athlete is you before you start pointing fingers at anything else, the car, the team, whatever, you have to make sure that you've got your ducks in a row. You need to manage yourself and make sure that you're getting the most out of yourself. And he's very much focusing on that. And that is the right attitude. But he also needs to be careful that he doesn't push it too far and end up almost blowing the negatives of what he's doing out of proportion and causing him to lose confidence. Because to a certain extent, you know, I've been there as a racing driver myself. I've had a run of bad results, and you start to look inward, you start to find, right, what am I doing wrong? And you almost get yourself in a negative cycle. And sometimes the best thing to do is almost just break it and go, do you know what? Tell yourself, do you know what? I've got to this position because I'm an excellent racing driver. Here are all the results that I've done in the past. Here's some evidence of why I deserve this seat. Just go out there, relax, and let yourself drive the car naturally, because the danger of thinking about, right, what am I doing wrong, is you start to overthink the driving. And that's when you drive worse, and you're not doing it naturally. And then you're not letting your natural skill and talent come out. And then also the whole thing on with that Yuki and all these people jumping on and saying, oh, Yuki should have got that seat, blah, blah, blah. Let's not forget that Yuki's first season and a half weren't exactly very good, in my opinion. He crashed a lot and he wasn't that fast. The only reason he's in the position he is now, and people are saying he should get that seat, he should be in there, is because he's been in Formula One since 2019, 2020. I can't remember exactly when he joined. But yeah, he's had a lot of seasons to get that experience. We should afford Liam the same opportunity. Again, I can agree with the argument then, why didn't they put Yuki in the seat in the first place? Hey, there's probably a lot going on behind the scenes at Red Bull that we don't even know about in terms of contracts and whatever. But I think Lawson needs more than a 2-race period for people to judge him. I think he's a very, very good racing driver. He's pretty much won in every category he's ever raced in single seaters and GTs. He raced in DTM and nearly won the championship in the 1 year he did in that, along with, of course, success in F2 and other series as well. So give him time. Hopefully he finds his confidence. He'll be right there.
I think we need to also give a shout out to the Racing Bulls because, in the sprint race here, Yuki Tsunoda finishing 6th, with Isaac Hadjar finally making his debut in an F1 race after what happened in Australia, finishing 13th. It didn't really work out for them in the Grand Prix as well. I mean, the two-stop strategy really killed them there, but it seems like, they are a solid partnership, and there are going to be race weekends this year where we see impressive results, maybe from both of them. Isaac Hadjar has kind of come in as maybe the least fancied rookie, maybe alongside Jack Doohan, and actually proven that he's not afraid to, put moves on people, but also he's got some real speed.
Hadjar, no doubt, has speed in a Formula One car. He's been quicker than Tsunoda on a number of sessions, and that's impressive considering, as I've just said, Tsunoda's been tipped for that Red Bull seat, had the years of experience in that team as well. No doubt he's got speed. He just needs to make sure that he can bring the results consistently. And I agree. I think Racing Bulls are going to be having some good results this season. I think they'll be disappointed, especially with this weekend, because their pace was actually a lot better than their results showed. And unfortunately, they kind of stuck to that 2-stop strategy that everyone thought was going to be the thing going into the race. And it kind of bit them in the bum, and they didn't get the results they wanted. So I look forward to points from both Yuki and Isaac going forward.
A team that did get points and did get, a great result this weekend was Haas. I said on the show last week that Haas looked like the worst team. Unfortunately for Sauber, it now looks like they've retaken their accolade, if that's what you call it, from last season, because they were down there. But for Haas to have 2 cars in the top 10 and score good points, considering both of those drivers are new to the team full time this year. Actually, Ollie Bearman has raced for Haas more than Esteban Ocon, but to get good points like they did, that shows real positivity. So I guess Australia was an anomaly, or they've done something massive to change things. Although I'm sure from a driver's perspective and from a racing perspective, you'll tell me that there's no way they could have changed much since Australia. So it must have just been a bit of a weird one for them.
I don't know. I mean, they're quite different circuits, Australia and China. Australia, of course, lots of short corners, slow and medium speed, a couple of high speed corners, but then China, a lot of long corners. And we heard from Esteban Ocon in his post-race interview when he got those points. He said, this circuit has a lot of the things that suits our car. So we've gone well. So potentially this is at the moment the upper limit of their performance in terms of relative performance to the other teams. But who knows? They've shown in the last couple of years that they have glimpses of really, really good results, like especially last year with Hulkenberg. A couple of times they were really quick, couldn't quite hold on to that pace in the race, but they're clearly trending in the right direction. They might not get it right every time, but they've got 2 drivers who are clearly able to push the car as well. Ocon drove well this weekend, and Bearman is a an effective rookie, doing a great job, getting some points too for the team and some great moves. He's clearly growing in confidence after what was also a tricky weekend, of course, last time out for him in Australia.
Yeah, Bearman was really on the charge in the Grand Prix. It wasn't such a great weekend again for Williams. I know Alex Albon got a top 10 and on his 29th birthday as well, so congratulations to him. But Carlos Sainz really isn't kind of getting what he wants out of that car just yet. Do you think that's just a case of just needing more time?
I think it is just more time, yeah. It'll be a very different car, very different setup, very different environment going from a Ferrari to a Williams. It's a very different outlook even. You know, when you're in Ferrari, that you're almost expecting wins and podiums. Williams want wins and podiums and they're striving to get there, but the whole ethos of the team is it's a very much a building stage and it's clearly working. They're going to be consistently looking at points now as opposed to occasionally looking at points now. But, you know, again, tricky weekend for him in Australia, small mistake under safety car and the end of the race. And then maybe things didn't quite go his way. But let's not forget, Alex Albon has a lot of experience in Formula One, a lot of experience in that team. He's an excellent Formula One driver. I still think underrated generally. So I expect to see Carlos up with Albon more often than not. And they'll be trading who's going to be finishing ahead of each other, I reckon, by the middle and end of the year. So yeah, not the ideal start for Sainz, but he'll get there.
He will. Time in that car is important. You know, we know from working in junior motorsports just how important having time in a car is, especially, you know, when we see kids stepping up from karting and, you know, there's been notable young drivers, actually. I mean, there's one in mind and I won't name him, but he's an F2 now who we started working with from a sort of media broadcast point of view, and he'd never driven a car before. He'd just, you know, come straight out of karting and, you know, he jumped straight up to F3 level, which seemed ridiculous at the time, and now he's doing F2, and it's all down to how much time, because I know that he had a lot of private testing time which helped to get him up there. And they were actually saying on the broadcast that what Mercedes have done really well with Kimi Antonelli is they gave him so much testing last year, something like 60 days in an old car that isn't obviously the current car and doesn't then, you know, fall under the rules of how much they can test, but it will feel the same. And you can see what he's doing. I mean, you know, finishing in the top 10 again, Kimi Antonelli, maybe that's what Red Bull should have done with Liam Lawson rather than throwing him in at the deep end. I wonder what you make of that.
Do you know what? I think it's a really good point. There's an argument going around that rookies are hugely underprepared going into Formula One now. They don't have the time to prepare, you know, like a day and a half at pre-season testing, plus any old car driving is, and let's assume you haven't done any old car driving, a day and a half, like that's nothing. That is track time, you know, that's effectively like going and playing 2 or 3 games of tennis before then doing the world tour. You know, it's ridiculous. I think it actually is something that needs to be looked at going forward, because the less time you give the rookies in machinery to get them up to speed with Formula One cars, and especially current Formula One cars, the more faith that the teams have to have in the rookies to put them in, which means that then generally you're going to get less rookies, or it's harder for a rookie to break into the sport. So you're going to get less new talent. So Antonelli, as you mentioned, had a lot of previous old Formula One car testing, and he's probably looking the best prepared and most consistent of those new drivers so far, I would say. You know, he's, again, not had any shining results yet, but kept the car on the road in Australia, did what he needed to do, just about, you know, apart from that little spin. Then had a solid, but no, not amazing, but a decent weekend, picking up points this weekend in China. That's so important, because the Formula One cars these days, even compared to a Formula 2 car, are absolutely rapid. There's so many systems on the cars. The way you have to drive them is different. Like anything, practice makes perfect. And the more practice you can give, especially young drivers when they're trying to build their skills and learn, is important.
Before anyone thinks I'm taking any credit, by the way, for that realization about testing days, that was a Bernie Collins analysis on the TV, which I watched just now. I was just interested to get your side of things as a driver. Obviously, she's more of a strategist and analyst, so it's interesting to see that you agree there. A driver that had a very tricky weekend and already has 4 penalty points on his license is Jack Doohan. 10-second penalty for pretty much the same thing in the sprint race and the main race. Is he just coming in too brash, or is he feeling the pressure, do you think?
I think he is just feeling the pressure a little bit, and it just showed a little bit. It's just little clumsy moves, really. He was just trying a little bit too hard, and they weren't horrific. You know, he didn't do it. He wasn't going out there to create issues. He wasn't doing anything stupid, but when you're just pushing that little bit too hard, that's when mistakes like that come in. You just make contact with drivers, you run wide, and he got the penalties, and I think they were deserved. I think he'll learn from them. I hope he does. I hope he doesn't feel too much pressure from all the rumours that people have been throwing around. And I know he actually in Australia got asked about the rumour of Colapinto, didn't he? Which, again, just seems a bit harsh. Driver hasn't even done a Formula One race and they're getting asked when they're going to get replaced or if they're going to be replaced. It's a bit of a strange situation. I hope that he gets given at least half a season before people in the team start to consider their options.
You say people asking him if the team are going to sign a reserve driver on a massive contract for 5 years. I think they're probably allowed to ask, because that's quite a weird thing for a team to do if, it's just a reserve driver. But I take your point. We need to finish by talking about George Russell. Often goes under the radar. In the latest series of Drive to Survive, there's kind of suggestions that there's always a mistake in George Russell and that, maybe he's never quite going to be the top level of elite drivers because of that. So far this season, we've seen him get 2 podiums and not really put a foot wrong.
Do you know what? I actually think that George Russell, along with Max Verstappen, second half of last year and this year so far, they've been the 2 drivers that stand out to me, just from their consistency of high performance. They're just week in, week out. George Russell is just there. And that qualifying lap that he did, that was a driver reaching the potential of their car. That car should not have been within, half a tenth in the end, or just under a tenth of pole, considering, where the relative performance of the cars were. Clearly he found something in terms of the tyre preparation. He alluded to it, but to be able to do that and then have a solid race, he was actually challenging the McLarens in the race. He overtook Lando Norris after the pit stops. That car should realistically not be able to do that at the moment. So he's driving very, very well. Definitely one of the drivers of last season for me. So far, one of the drivers of this season. I completely think that him and Verstappen are the 2 drivers that I think are at the highest level at the moment, in my opinion.
And also he's done that while taking on the role of being a kind of older figure, a mentor to Kimi Antonelli as well. So a lot of pressure on his shoulders. And so far he's doing incredible things with that Mercedes. That's pretty much the race covered off. Obviously we have Japan in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm sure there'll be something going on in the F1 paddock in the next few days in between. Also, by the way, Antonelli was the driver of the day. Is that just because young people are voting and they like him?
I was confused about that. I was about as confused as he was. I think I even said it in the updates live. I said Antonelli got driver of the day. Not really sure why. He had a pretty average race, but Yeah,
it's good for the confidence at least. So we have Japan coming up. Obviously, we need Liam Lawson to get a good result there, but he's driven in Super Formula. He knows those tracks really well, and it's going to be interesting to see who's. If we have a similar kind of level of hierarchy of which teams are doing well. But I feel like most races this year, we're going to have some big surprises, which I'm looking forward to. I want to finish just briefly and just get your thoughts on, obviously, the news of the late, great Eddie Jordan. We knew he was ill. We didn't realise that it would maybe be a swift, his demise, unfortunately, as it was. But we saw some beautiful tributes across the weekend. I saw Aston Martin had, kind of abbreviated version of the first ever Jordan logo on the back of their car. And we saw other teams marking, his legacy in different ways. And we've seen people sharing stories about Eddie Jordan. And I think when, I shared my story on talkSPORT this week, it was just that he was just a character that everyone loved and quite an unpredictable kind of guy. And when you can do great things in a sport, but, he wasn't afforded the tools or the backing to do maybe the greatest things like you see some teams do. But the fact, when you learn about his story, that he managed to get his team to Formula One and to win races is incredible. And then you find out that it's all done because he's basically was the king of wheeler dealering and making kind of bets on himself and banking on himself and the people around him. That was even better to see. And, hearing stories of how he's given drivers their break in the sport and how many drivers owe their career to Eddie Jordan. Pedro de la Rosa was interviewed on by Ted Kravitz. I don't know if you saw that, as he was trying to leave the track to go to a sponsor event, and he was clearly in a hurry, but also wanted to share his story about Eddie Jordan. And he said some amazing things about him. So if you haven't seen that, I would look that up. But I'm just wondering, did you ever get to meet Eddie? I was only lucky to meet him a couple of times.
No, unfortunately, I never met Eddie Jordan, but it would have been an absolute honour to have met him. What an absolute legend he was, a completely unique character, but that's why he was able to do what he did. And, he built a team up, started, he was a driver in Formula 3 in the 70s, then started his team, went from Formula 3 to Formula 1, took victories, and he kind of did every role. He was a driver, then he was a team boss, then he was a pundit, and a very good pundit at that. He would cut through the BS, which I was always enjoyed by a lot. He had some fun, he had some, some strange takes. Sometimes they were way off, sometimes they were bang on. But what an absolute legend. And I think it's really good to see that his passing has been remembered well, but also everyone's been very positive about it. I think that's what he would have wanted. He loved the sport. That was why he was in it. And he's going to be sorely missed, I'm sure.
I saw Jake Humphrey actually speaking about their 4 years together when they were working on TV with David Coulthard. And I think when I was, for some reason, that was a time where I watched F1 kind of religiously while I was studying or something like that. And that's kind of my probably favourite presenting trio because they were always having so much fun. And actually, Eddie, the last time I spoke to him, which was back in 2023, we were at a yacht show because, Eddie loved his yachts. And he told me a story about how, things got a bit out of hand, let's say, while they were enjoying a few drinks after one of the race weekends, and they ended up basically starting the broadcast for the race day on the Sunday in David Coulthard's hotel room with them two in bed together because basically they'd overslept and they couldn't get to where they needed to. It was a case of, well, if the crew can get here, we can do the broadcast. And that just provided, some magical moments that is less kind of formulaic and kind of stiff as we see with some of the presentation these days. No discredit to anyone, but it was kind of a rock and roll vibe that only Eddie Jordan can bring. So I'm sure his, name will not, obviously it will live on. His legacy will live on in motorsport and in media as well. But I know that he was, buying London Irish rugby team to try and get them back out of administration. And I know that he's been supporting a lot of young drivers and people back in Ireland, and he's seen as an absolute god there. So, his name is going to live on in the sport, but also outside of the sport for a long time. So great to see people marking their respect to Eddie Jordan. And if you want to see more, of course, you can check out more on this talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel. We had loads of people on the day to pay their respects and said some amazing, actually the thing that came out of it actually was some of the amazing stories. Everyone knows that Eddie Jordan was a fantastic person, but it was some of the stories that maybe you wouldn't have heard before, but people are happy to share. And I'm sure Eddie would have been very happy for people to share stories of him basically being the life and soul of the party and also a bit of a maverick, which was beautiful to see. So check that out on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel. Piers Pryor, thank you very much for joining me. We'll be back to take a look back at the Japanese Grand Prix in a couple of weekends' time. You can listen to On Track on talkSPORT 2 from 2 p.m. every week. This coming weekend, we're actually going to be in Austin, Texas for the MotoGP, so something a little bit different there. You can get that as a podcast as well. And as I say, the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel is the place to be for all of your motorsports content on the talkSPORT network.